Hold on one second. Welcome today to the webinar series, What Lies Beneath? Signature Species of the Delaware Estuary. Today is part 2 of a 3-part series focused on oysters. And my name is Virginia Vassilotti, and I am the Schuylkill Action Network Coordinator at the Partnership for the Delaware Estuary. I'll be moderating today's webinar along with Emily Baumbach, who will be managing the Q&A. Emily, do you want to turn on your video real quick and just say hi?
Hello, everyone. Thanks again for joining. I'm Emily Baumbach, and I'm the Estuary Program Coordinator for the Partnership for the Delaware Estuary. And as Virginia said, I'll be facilitating the question and answer sessions after each of our 3 speakers today through the Q&A box.
Thanks, Emily. And so quickly, just some tech information before we get started. First, all participants are automatically muted with video turned off when joining the webinar. So you should only be able to see presenters and moderators' videos when they are speaking during the webinar. Second, as Emily just mentioned, if you have any questions during or after the presentations, please use the Q&A feature to ask those questions. She'll be sifting through those to find any common questions. And then we have some time after each of the 3 speakers to answer those questions. Third, the chat is disabled for participants. However, the moderators will be sharing links and resources with attendees in the chat. And then last, the webinar is being recorded in case you would like to view later. And so for those of you who aren't familiar with the Partnership for the Delaware Estuary, or PDE, we're an environmental nonprofit that was established in 1996. PDE is the host of the Delaware Estuary Program, one of 28 national estuary programs designated by Congress to protect America's estuaries. And our mission is to lead science-based and collaborative efforts to improve the tidal Delaware River and Bay, which spans Delaware, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. And so before we get started, we'd love to learn more about the audience and who's in the room. So we'll be asking a couple questions. So the first question you'll see on your screen is, which sector do you represent? We have government agency, nonprofit, private entity, university, affiliate, K through 12 educator, and general interest of topic or other. So we'll give folks a few minutes to answer that. All right, so you can see the results are shared right now, and the majority of folks are just general interest in this topic. So that's exciting that you all are here with us today. Leah, do you want to administer the second one? And so our second question is, where are you tuning into this webinar from? The Mid-Atlantic East Coast, Northeast Coast, Southeast Coast, Gulf Coast, West Coast, other, or outside the US? All right, and the majority is from, our region here in the Mid-Atlantic East Coast, and then some others from the North and Southeast Coast. And then we have one last question, which is, how did you hear about this webinar? From our social media, our email listserv, our website, YouTube, from an employer or colleague, from a family or friend, or from other. And this is just helpful for us to figure out our best ways to market these webinars in the future. Great, so it seems like most folks heard about this webinar from our email listserv. And then Leah, you can go ahead and stop sharing that. All right, thank you. And so thanks everyone for filling those out. We'll be doing a couple other polls throughout our session today just to make it a little bit more interactive. And quickly, we just want to give a special thanks to Ramble for being the sponsor of today's webinar. And as Emily and I mentioned, we do have 3 speakers today to present about oysters. Our speakers are Dave Bushek, Lisa Calvo, and Sarah Bouboulis. And so Dave will present first on general oyster biology. Lisa will present second on oyster aquaculture, and Sarah will present last on PD's shell recycling and restoration programs. And I'll introduce them all now so we can transition quickly between each presentation. And so presenters, when I introduce you, please turn on your video and wave to the participants. First, we have Dr. Dave Bushek, who's the director of the Haskin Shellfish Research Laboratory at Rutgers University, where he is also a professor of marine and coastal sciences. He is an expert in shellfish ecology, parasitology, and aquaculture, and is perhaps best known for his work on dermo disease in the eastern oyster, which is native to the Atlantic coast of North America. Dave, do you want to turn on your video real quick and just say hi?
Hi, everyone.
Thanks. And then next up, we have Lisa Calvo, who serves as the Aquaculture Program Coordinator at the New Jersey Sea Grant Consortium and marine scientist at Rutgers University, where she supports aquaculture development in New Jersey. She has worked in the field of shellfish research and extension for 30 years, serving as a marine scientist at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science prior to working at Rutgers. Lisa, do you want to turn on your video real quick and also say hi?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining.
Thanks. And then last we have Sarah Bouboulis, who is PD's Habitat Projects Coordinator. She installs clean water investments like rain gardens and natural shorelines. She also works with local businesses, schools, and organizations to beautify their landscapes, manage polluted runoff, and engage their employees and neighbors. And Sarah, do you want to quickly say hi as well?
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming today.
Great. And so with that, we can go ahead and get started on the webinar. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and Dave, you can go ahead and share yours.
Okay. This works. Does that look good? Let's see. Oh, I need to share. Did that share or not?
No, it didn't yet. It's the green share screen at the bottom, and then select your PowerPoint. There we go. Now we see it, and you can just make the slideshow full screen.
Okay, how's that?
Perfect.
Okay, well, thank you for that introduction, and thank you everyone for joining. I hope that we can present you with some interesting information. I'm going to speak a bit about, a little bit about ecology and biology of oysters, but mostly about how we manage the oyster fishery in Delaware Bay. And then Lisa's going to follow that up, I think, talking about aquaculture. I like this photo. I start with it in a lot of my presentations because it sort of implies the history, the long history of oystering in Delaware Bay. Starting out, can you see my mouse?
Yep.
Okay, starting out with fishing under sail power here, that then transitioned into mechanized boats here. This boat, the Linda W in front, actually used to look like this one in the back, but had the sails removed and a pilot house put on here, and then all this mechanization to help harvest it. So oystering has been going on for a long time in Delaware Bay. When we think about oysters today, one of the things that people often think about is how they're actually a habitat. Oysters build reefs, and here's a picture of a reef in a bay, and you can see the oysters are all clustered together. That actually attach to each other. They cement themselves to a hard substrate, and the best hard substrate for them to do that to is another oyster. And so that provides them with a hard place to attach to, a place to grow. If they're attached to where an oyster lived before, it's probably a good spot where there's plenty of food. There's also lots of other individuals around them to reproduce with. As they do that, they grow and provide a lot of ecosystem services. these include altering the hydrology of the system. So as water flows by, it changes the flow of the water. It actually creates friction that slows down the water, which stops erosion and things like that. They filter feed. So when they're feeding, they're actually pushing water across their gills and removing out sediments and also food particles, phytoplankton that's in the water. And that helps clarify the water. You can see right over top of these oysters here, it's pretty clear. And then as you look up into the water column, it gets a little cloudier. It's because they're removing the particles that are in the water. As they do that and they consume the food particles, those are basically nutrients that are bound up into phytoplankton, small plant-like organisms. They digest those and then they excrete those nutrients, as ammonia and nitrogen, things like that, phosphorus that you might use to fertilize your lawn. And that actually recycles those nutrients so they're available for another round of growth of phytoplankton. But they take a portion of those nutrients, of the nitrogen and the carbon, and they incorporate them into their body tissues, into their shells, and we call that sequestering them. So they help pull excess carbon out of the water so it doesn't then vaporize and volatilize off and become CO2 and end up becoming a greenhouse gas. And so they pull that out of there. And if there's excess nitrogen, they're also incorporating some of that into their tissues as well, so they can help with runoff of fertilizers and things from our agricultural systems. I mentioned earlier that they slow the water flow. That helps to protect erosion. They can actually stop some wave action. I think you might hear a little bit more about that when possibly when Sarah talks about recycling shells and how we use them to create something called living shorelines. And they provide a healthy and I have in italics here, potentially sustainable, environmentally beneficial food. And I say potentially sustainable because if it's not managed properly, how we harvest them, then you're not going to be able to sustain that. You can harvest them faster than they can reproduce and replace themselves. And that's a problem. So that's one of the main things we try and do. So as I said, this has been going on for many years. This is a picture from, I think, the 1930s. I think I cropped off the year on there at the bottom. But this is what the fishing port of Bivalves, New Jersey, where I'm actually sitting right now presenting this talk, is located. This is where the Haskin Shellfish Research Laboratory is. And this would be the view from behind our lab back then of all of the oyster boats heading out to harvest oysters out near the mouth of the river and further up in the bay. So it was quite a large industry 100 years ago and even longer than that. As I said, that most of those sails were pulled off, and modern oyster boats are now mechanized and look like this. The hulls of these boats are actually the same hulls that were used back then. They've maintained those hulls, but have added the pilot house and this gear on here. And what you see on here on the side of this boat is an oyster dredge, and this is called a dredge fishery. And they will drop this dredge over the side of the boat. It will come up into this hopper here, which then will unload it onto a conveyor belt, and somebody can then sort the catch. Some of it will go through this color machine here, the oysters that are too small or the shells, and go overboard back onto the oyster reef to either grow if they're small oysters or provide habitat. And then what's harvested will then move along the conveyor belt up here and end up piling on to the dock, the deck of the boat here as their harvest. And they'll bring that ashore, and that's what they'll call their landings. So it's a portion of the population that they'll harvest and they'll bring back. To understand how this is done and how one might manage it, we sort of need to know where the resource is located in the bay. And so here's a schematic of Delaware Bay. So Wilmington is up in this area up here. This is Cape Henlopen down here, and Cape May is down here. And you can see the bay is a typical kind of funnel-shaped estuarine system, a classical bay system with fresh water coming in from the Delaware River up here and ocean water coming in from down here near the mouth of the bay. And along that region, we have oyster beds that are up in the upper part of the bay here, and not so much down here. So all these black polygons represent oyster beds. We call those, they're labeled as seed beds here because this used to be what we call a seed fishery. I'll get into that in a little bit. And along this bay is a gradient of salinity. Got this, so I don't have the salinity grade down here later. But so this is fresh water up here, no salt in the water. And then as you move down the bay and it mixes with ocean water, which has about 35 parts per thousand of salt in it, it changes from 0 to 35. And there's a gradient along there. And these parameters here, growth, condition, predation, disease, mortality, those are all going to increase as you move towards the ocean. There are intertidal and subtidal aquaculture occurring here, and Lisa will talk about that. Most of the intertidal aquaculture occurs here. And intertidal means that when the tide is low and you can walk out onto the sandy flats, they can culture oysters there. And then subtidal would be out here in these former planted grounds, and that's going to be below the water line all the time. Another important aspect of this resource and where it's distributed is down along in this on this coastal area here are extensive tidal flats, and those extensive tidal flats are an important spawning ground for horseshoe crabs, which attracts a lot of migratory birds through every spring to feed on what's there. And so even though we're talking about managing an oyster fishery, we've got things like aquaculture going on that needs to be considered. We've got things like endangered species that are using these habitats as well, or other species also where these activities may occur. And we need to consider all those things when we're managing this sort of a resource. So as oysters build these habitats, the fisheries, and you can see the habitat here, the fisheries are actually harvesting them because the oysters that they're harvesting are in fact the habitat. So if you're going to manage this, what you want to do is you want to find a balance between this. How do we balance out removing this while sustaining this habitat that we think is so important, actually we know is so important? We know that these healthy oyster reefs promote a healthy ecosystem. And we know that a healthy oyster fishery helps promote economic stability in places like rural southern New Jersey, where there's not a lot of other activities going on. So we need a mechanism to figure out just how we can do that, promote that. How do we achieve this? Well, it's kind of complex. And so here, if we consider the oysters here are all a whole slew of things around here that they're interacting with. So we're talking about the fishery primarily here, but the fishery is impacted by diseases that can kill the oysters. There's also aquaculture going on nearby. There's also a lot of people that are interested in restoring and enhancing the oyster populations for their ecological value and their ecosystem services. People are now building living shorelines out of oysters. We'll hear about that in a little bit. I mentioned the endangered species. And then there's also an issue of public health. Many of you may know that if you consume raw oysters, there's during the wrong time of year, during an outbreak of a bacteria that can accumulate in the oysters, you could get sick from eating them. And so there's a strict public health sanitation protocol that's enforced on the harvesting and the consumption of oysters. So all of that is involved in managing even just this one component, the fishery here. How do we do that? Well, currently for the fishery, we basically lock all the stakeholders up in a room for a couple of days, and here you see them all happily sitting together in our room. This is our library here. And we do this once a year, and it's actually quite productive and quite successful. And it's really a model system that we've developed for the country and actually elsewhere in the world where people are trying to manage resources like an oyster fishery. Because you have these stakeholders that need to work together. You have the managers that are in control of what can be harvested when and where. You have the industry that wants to harvest those things. And then you have a number of researchers that are interested in understanding just how those two things are interacting and what's happening to the population. So our system looks something like this, and we've been doing this since 1953. Actually, the industry came to Rutgers University when they noticed that the supply of oysters on their seed beds was being depleted and wanted to know why, and could the researchers at Rutgers University help them out. And so at that point in time, actually, Rutgers researchers and the DEP were linked together very tightly. They've been decoupled now because DEP here needs to manage the resource, and Rutgers wants to be an independent party that just helps assess the resource. And we work with the industry and a state-appointed council of industry members called the Shellfish Council. We work together to understand what's happening with the oyster population and use that then to inform how the fishery is managed. So traditionally, here's that salinity gradient along the bay, the same diagram of the bay here. We have these seed beds here, and then below here I have these odd-shaped polygons, one on the Delaware side of the bay and one on the New Jersey side of the bay, that show leased planted grounds. And so these were areas that each state leased out to individuals or companies where they could harvest young seed oysters, small oysters, and plant them on their grounds here to then allow them to grow to market size. And then in this area of the bay, they're going to get a little bit saltier, which will change the flavor to something that's typically more preferred. And then they could market them. So it was a two-step process that looked something like this. So the seed were moved down to these leases, left for anywhere from a few weeks to several months or even a year, and then harvested and taken to market. The way they managed the fishery was they had something called a bay season. So the fishermen were allowed to go up here during anywhere from 2 weeks to 12 weeks in the springtime and move those oysters down. They couldn't market the oysters until they'd been moved down to their lease, and then they could market them there. Well, when they noticed that the population was declining, Doc Haskin, who our lab is named after, decided that they should limit the amount of oysters that they're allowed to pull down here. And he said that he established this rule that if they pulled up a dredge, as you saw in the previous picture, of oysters, and 40% of it contained live oysters, then it was okay to continue to harvest on there. But once it fell before that 40% volume in the dredge hall of live oysters, they could no longer harvest that bed because he was concerned they were going to impact that bed too much. So that was the very first control mechanism that was enforced on here, other than the timing and duration of the bay season. So when that happened, to supplement that, they would bring oysters in from out of state to increase production. So they might go down to Chesapeake Bay or maybe up to Long Island Sound and bring in some additional oysters and put them down on their leases here to increase it. And this is what we might call an extensive form of aquaculture. But it was actually unsustainable because of disease that you'll see in a minute that moved in, and also the limitations of seed. So if they were having to go out of state because they depleted all their seed up here, that out of state depletion was going to happen as well. The production became limited on here on that. So it wasn't really sustainable in this fashion. If we look at the history of the fishery, we see a decline, and we can see how it has evolved over time. So here I've got a graph showing the landings, what was harvested actually in millions of bushels from 1880, which is when they first started tallying these records, even though the fishery had been started perhaps 100 years earlier than that. And what was happening over time. And there was a lot of fluctuation up and down initially. You see these declines here and another big decline here. Now, this is landings. It's not necessarily what's happening with the population, but it's what they're actually harvesting. So there are things like market forces, wars, world wars that happen in there, precipitous fall here related to perhaps the Depression. Those sorts of things were happening. So the fishery has declined, but it has evolved over time. Currently, the harvest is less than 1% of these historic levels. But again, that doesn't necessarily mean that's what's happening with the population. So the abundance of oysters in the bay may not be related to this decline directly, although it is a key factor in what can be harvested. Also on this graph, what we know is that at this point in time, these data that are shown here are from the entire state of New Jersey. I should mention this data is only for New Jersey. It's not, does not include Delaware. And so this is statewide. So they were harvesting from Raritan Bay and from the mouth of Mullica River and other areas. Barnegat Bay had a large oyster population at this time in it. But those populations actually were over harvested substantially and declined. And then we went to mostly Delaware Bay here. And so from here forward, it's almost all entirely Delaware Bay harvests. 1953 was when they were starting to see declines. They were trying to supplement the population with out-of-state seed, but they were worried about their beds. And then we saw this precipitous crash happen here. Well, it turns out that that had nothing to do with harvesting, but some diseases had moved into the bay. The first major one was something called MSX disease. Now these diseases, the second one was dermo. These diseases kill oysters. They're not harmful to humans at all, or pretty much anything else that eats the oyster. But they do kill the oysters, and there's some pictures of them here. This one is a histology section, and this large body here has all these little cells in it called plasmodia. MSX stands for, these are nuclei. MSX stands for multinucleated sphere X for unknown. They didn't know what it was when they discovered it. It's now called Haplosporidium nelsoni. Here's another picture of a different stage of it. And then dermo is one that moved in later on. And this is a picture of a stained tissue section we used to identify an infection. All those black cells are these parasites, and then this is what they look like if we culture them in our laboratory. All right, so disease, as a result of this, became a major source of mortality and actually controls the population. And ultimately, as a result of this, the seed fishery has changed into something we call a direct market fishery. And so instead of harvesting those seed oysters and planting them on their leases, they now harvest market-size oysters. So one reason for the decline is a change in the type of fishery that we see. I want to show you some population data now. This is fishery data that you're looking at here, what they harvest. This next graph shows population data. So in the gray bars here, what you see is plotted on this axis. That's the number of oysters, okay? And these are times 10 to the 10th. So this times 10 to the 9th here. This is 5 billion oysters right here. So this is 40 billion oysters at the top of the scale here. So there's a lot of oysters in the bay. And at this period of time when they asked Rutgers to start looking at, they were at a relatively low level. In the red line, what you see is the mortality level that we were measuring in the population from the surveys that we started. So you see that during this period of time, there was a relatively high level of mortality. It bounces up and down a lot, but on average, it's relatively high. And then for some reason in the 60s, we don't fully understand yet, it dropped down substantially. So mortality level dropped down. And also we started doing something called shell planting, or the industry did, where they were taking the oysters from the shucking houses and placing them back out onto the beds to rebuild the habitat that they had harvested. And they would, I said massive shell planting. They were doing this on the millions of bushels of shell were being planted annually during this period of time. And that helped result in this big jump up of oysters. This large increase here was probably unsustainable for the amount of food that the oysters can build, so it didn't last very long. But you could see that the bay actually has a capacity to hold quite a lot more oysters than it was. And then in the 80s, as the disease level ramped up again, MSX came right back. We had an even higher level of MSX for a while. But we did get a little bit of rebound to the population here until derma moved in later on. And then we also had a period in the 2000s, early 2000s, of recruitment failures, where the oysters, just the reproduction was not happening, and we weren't seeing a lot of recruitment. And so that depressed the population. So we've been combating these disease metrics in recent years and trying to increase the population that way. So We know that the abundance of the population today is largely controlled by mortality, which is largely caused by disease, and that one of the primary mechanisms we have to combat this is shell planting or habitat enhancement, and this is critical. And if you aren't familiar with shell planting or what it looks like, here's a picture of what it looks like in Delaware Bay. These are actually clam shells mounted on top of this boat here, taken from a clam processing plant that's just down the road from us. Oyster shells work just as well if you can recover them, and we'll hear about that from Sarah again. And this is a picture of a clam shell with oyster spat. These are baby oysters. They're probably the size of a nickel or a quarter maybe in this photo, that have attached to this larger clamshell here. Now they don't need an entire clamshell, just a bit of the clamshell down there will work. So even if the shells are broken up, it will recruit these fine. It just needs to be placed on the bottom of the bay at the right time of the year when the oyster larvae are swimming around in the plankton. So as I said, today, this is a primary enhancement tool, and it's a restoration tool, and actually the industry taxes themselves. This is not a state law or anything like that or a regulatory requirement, but the industry, the Shellfish Council, decided that they saw the benefits of this. So every time they harvest a bushel of oysters, they pay into a fund that will then pay to plant approximately 150,000 bushels of this shell every year. So it sort of is a self-sustaining mechanism for the industry to do this. It's in their best interest to do it, and it's in the interest of the oyster population. So it's a really nice mechanism to help sustain the fishery. All right, how am I doing on time? Okay. I'll take that as a yes. All right. So,
sorry, Dave, I couldn't get to the unmute fast enough. Yeah, if you want to just wrap up quickly, we are a little bit over, but we did start a little late.
So, so this coordinated effort works really well, and here's the result of this. When we started this direct market fishery, we took a little while to figure out how to manage it. You see these ups and downs here, but once we did that, we looked back and looked at what was working. And now today, this is what our fishery harvests look like. We stabilized them, and now through this shell planting effort, we're starting to increase our harvests. And so it appears that we have now a stable and sustainable fishery. People get concerned about seeing those dredges often moved off the side of the boat, but really they're only harvesting about 2% of the stock in any given year. The essential element to make this function is this stakeholder collaboration. So we have the industry in there, the regulators in there, and the researchers collaborating together to make this work. And the absolutely essential tool that is absent from other fisheries is that we have a quantitative survey that tells us how many oysters are out in the bay. That allows us to create a strict quota, which we call a total allowable catch. And we manage that based on the disease level that's happening in the different portions of the bay and supplement that with our rebuilding program. So all these things together help us create a stable and sustainable fishery. And so I will end there and either take questions or pass it on to Lisa.
All right, great. Yeah, thanks so much, Dave. That was a very informative presentation on Delaware Bay oyster management. And just for the sake of time, since we do have 3 speakers on this webinar today, we're just going to jump to the next talk. Feel free to email Dave if you have any questions. I'll put his email address in the chat box that all attendees can view. And a few PD staff here on the webinar today can also help to answer some of the questions that came into the Q&A box already, and we can type some responses via the box directly. And if we do have a few minutes at the end of the webinar, we can come back to some of the questions that we've received already. So we're gonna go ahead and move on to Lisa's presentation on oyster aquaculture. So Lisa, you can pull up your presentation now if you're ready.
How's that? Can you see it?
So we can't see anything yet. Did you hit the share screen at the bottom?
Good now.
All right, great. Yep, and then if you just want to, yep, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. So I'm going to transition and talk a little bit about oyster aquaculture, really this new contemporary oyster farming that is just exploding across the nation at this point in time. I'm going to also give a nod to Dr. Hal Haskin. Dave mentioned him and his amazing work, recognized worldwide for his work with oyster biology and shellfish and oyster management. And Doc Haskin was the director of the laboratory at the time that the diseases hit the bay in the late 50s. And he really had the kind of the foresight to take those surviving oysters and begin an oyster breeding program with them. So he's really a pioneer in oyster breeding, and it was his work and the work of several of his contemporaries that paved the way for contemporary hatchery-based oyster aquaculture. The image on the left actually shows one of his cycles. So what Doc did was he took these survivors, he produced offsprings from them, and then he would challenge them in the natural environment against the diseases. And he did this for decades. And with 3-year cycles of evaluations and new generations. And the cage on the left shows his disease tolerant stock, and the cage on the right shows the wild susceptible stock. And you can see there was a great, after this 3-year trial, those cages at the start had the same number of oysters in them. And he was able to improve the survival, upwards of 70%. So terrific work. And really thanks to him, today we have a vibrant and robust oyster aquaculture industry in the US. So what is aquaculture? When we talk about aquaculture, many people have sort of a bad concept about it, but if we think about aquaculture, it's really farming of aquatic organisms. It involves some intervention in the animal's life cycle rearing process. So you're seeding, or you're stocking, or you're feeding, adding protection from predators, planting shell. That's all considered an aquaculture practice. Aquaculture also implies, in this instance of contemporary farming, ownership of the stock. So the farmers basically purchase the seed, just as if you were farming corn, you grow it up, it's your stock, it's your product, even though you're working in public waters. The first phase of oyster farming begins in a hatchery. And there are something like 50 or more hatcheries along the east coast of the United States. They produce a variety of shellfish species. Oysters, probably one of the larger abundant species that they produce. In the hatchery operators will take these selected brood stock oysters or parent oysters. They'll produce larvae in the laboratory, in the hatchery under very controlled conditions. So they can control the temperature, they can control the filtration of the water, and they can also add nutrients by way of cultured algae at the early phases. So after those initial few weeks of larval rearing, the set oysters, once they've got that hard shell and they're very young, you can see the top left, those little tiny sand-like particles are actually baby oysters, which we would call seed. At that stage, they're ready to be exposed to the natural nutrients in raw seawater, and often they're held in a land-based nursery system, and these are just some different types of systems shown here. Sometimes farmers will take them directly to the field and grow them up from there. Once they're about preferably 2 to 10 millimeters in size, these seed or baby oysters are ready to go to a farm in natural waters in the field. And they'll be placed in some type of container, plastic mesh bag with a very fine mesh, or the actual design of the container will depend on the conditions and the grow out location. Dave showed, he mentioned that there were subtidal sites where there are on-bottom cages, and I'll show some pictures of that. There might be floating cages. So it's very dependent on the site and the grower's preference. But basically the farmer is purchasing the seed from a hatchery, and then they're taking them to their farm site to grow them out. This is a site in the lower Delaware Bay in this intertidal area. So the top photo image shows the site at high tide, and the bottom left image shows the site at low tide. And you can see these extensive sand flats that Dave mentioned. And this is the region in this lower Bay shore area called the Cape Shore. And that's really where this contemporary hatchery-based oyster farming began in the late 1990s in New Jersey. It started earlier in other parts of the East Coast, but our first farm was actually the Cape May Salt Farm, and that today remains our largest farm in the state, nationally recognized products. Okay, so in this intertidal area, the type of cultivation system that is used is called rack and bag. And this is very similar. It was really inherited from Europe. And if you go to France, or you go to Ireland, where you have these intertidal locations, this is a type of method that's utilized. And basically you have a steel rack that holds the oysters up off the bottom, and then the oysters are contained in these mesh bags, which come in a variety of mesh sizes. So you would start with very fine mesh when they're very small, and you would work your way up to a larger mesh as they grow. In the instance of the subtidal bottom culture on those planting grounds that Dave mentioned, that's deeper water. So you need a much more robust system, and you need some additional capital to be able to deploy these very large cages that can hold up to the rough conditions of the upper bay. And then you might also consider, for some sites, floating culture systems. And basically these are long line systems where cages have independent floats on them and they're clipped to a long line. And in 2018, Delaware finally passed regulations to allow oyster aquaculture to develop. And this is a type of method that might be used in some of the inland bay sites where they're culturing what they're marketing as inland bay oysters. And that's primarily happening in the Rehoboth Bay area, is my understanding. So a variety of methods. The choice is largely up to the grower, dependent on the site, and of course, a variety of permits. Regardless of the method utilized, oyster farming is a very intensive process. These intertidal sites are very rich with biota. The oysters get heavily fouled with a variety of organisms, and it's important to keep them fairly clean so they don't smother and they continue to get the water and resources that they need to grow. I should mention that other than the gear that the oysters are placed in and the oysters themselves, there are really no other inputs. Once you're growing oysters in the field, you're not adding antibiotics, you're not adding any kind of food source. It's all just the oysters are feeding on the natural phytoplankton in the water. So, very green grow out method and production system. As you're farming, you're also constantly sorting and sizing oysters. So if you have a bag of oysters, even though they may all be the same age, you're going to have a variety of growth rates among the oysters in that bag. So farmers will constantly pull away slow growers from fast growers. They'll be sorting for market oysters, and it's a constant process. For most farms, there's no restriction on harvest season for farm-raised oysters. So some farms will run year-round and harvest all year long. But the bulk of the farms, I would say, run from maybe March until December, depending on the winter weather. If it's warm, they might go longer for our area anyway. But very, very labor intensive. So a little bit different from the fishery, which is also a challenging, and fishermen work very hard. It's just that the labor inputs in this type of method are much larger. So it could take from 1.5 to 3 years to grow an oyster to market size. And typically oysters are marketed somewhere upward of 2.5 inches to 4 inches. And again, it depends on the grower's choice and the type of market that they're looking at. Some markets love a petite cocktail oyster. Other markets love a nice large oyster. So that's really up to the grower for branding and market determination and their business model. But one thing that the farm-raised oysters really brings to the table is a very consistent, high-quality half-shell oyster. So because we can breed for disease tolerance and fast growth and different shell characteristics, we can present a very consistent product that's high in quality. And the bulk of the oysters will go to the half-shell trade if it's a farm-raised oyster. So I hope all of you are oyster eaters, and if you're not, I hope you'll be convinced to become oyster eaters. But if you hadn't noticed, there's quite an oyster renaissance that's been occurring in the last decade. There's a lot of excitement around oysters and eating oysters, and people of all ages are eating oysters. Keen recognition of the nutritional benefits. Oysters are an extremely healthy food. They really boost your body's overall function and health, providing low calorie source of protein, high omega-3 fatty acids, and filled with important essential nutrients and vitamins, vitamin A, E, C, zinc, iron, calcium, selenium, B12, all really great sources of food. So it's a really perfect food, and it's a delicious food. So that's one reason we're seeing an oyster renaissance. It's also about this availability of very high quality oysters, consistently high quality and very nice, and a lot of excitement just around eating oysters. There's tremendous branding, and each individual farmer has their own story, and they market in really fun ways. So there's also this push for supporting local growers, eating local seafood, eating local products, knowing your farmers and where your food comes from. And I think that has also contributed to this oyster renaissance. Restaurants in Philadelphia are very supportive of New Jersey farmers, shellfish farmers, and Delaware shellfish farmers. And it's really great to see that developing. If you have not eaten oysters, one thing you'll want to know about oysters is that not every oyster tastes the same. And actually, an oyster from one area can vary in flavor throughout the course of the year based on the oyster's reproductive condition, what they're feeding on, the amount of salt in the water at that particular time. So oyster eating is really an experience, and I think people are really drawn to that. So you can have a plate of 12 oysters from 12 different places. Each oyster will have a unique texture and flavor, and that creates a very exciting dining experience. So this flavor variability based on place has been called miroir, mirroring terroir, which we've come to recognize in wines and grapes. So just as grapes take on the flavor of where they're grown, oysters will do the same. This is just a chart I pulled up from Samuel & Son Seafood Company, based in Philadelphia, local distributor, huge distributor of seafood. On this day in this week, they had some more than 30 varieties of oysters from the United States and Canada on their availability list. And you can see that oysters are presented based on their name, which is sometimes place-based and sometimes it's just fun, like Sweet Jesus and Sugar Shack and Stormy Bay. But the list will include the area of origin where it's grown. So if you're familiar with that area, you'll know whether it's a very salty or briny oyster or sweet oyster, and then a flavor profile. So you can see here, Cape May salts, for instance, briny flavor with a tender texture and a clean ocean finish. So again, you can really experience a tremendous variety of flavors when you're eating oysters, and that's really fun. So oysters are delicious, they're fun to eat, they're nutritious, and they're also very important to the economy. I pulled this statistic from the NOAA site, NOAA Aquaculture site, and oysters are the leading marine aquaculture species in the United States, with something like 36 million pounds landed in 2017 with a value of $186 million. So we have all these wonderful oyster farms on our bay shores, providing jobs, producing very sustainable food, a very green practice, and the strategic plan for aquaculture in the United States calls for an increase in production of aquaculture products in the United States. So also very important, if you read my title slide, I called it a green cuisine. And Dave talked a lot about what oysters do as ecosystem engineers and ecosystem service providers. They really support healthy ecosystems in a variety of ways, providing habitat and structure, cycling nutrients, filtering water. The image on the left is taken from an oyster farm last year. We have a study at the Rutgers laboratory, the Haskin lab, where we have GoPro cameras underwater on the farms, and we're actually documenting fish interactions with the gear. And there were something like 21 different species from 9 taxa that were found on and around the farm. So they're really, even though it's a farming practice, these oysters are providing the same ecological services that a wild population would provide, very sustainable. The farmers are replacing the stock as they harvest and providing that continuous input of these very hardworking oysters. So I'm going to just close with this quote from Chef Barton Sieber. He's one of these hotshot chefs. I love his cookbook for Cod and Country. And he suggests that eating farmed oysters is your patriotic duty. They are not just sustainable, they actually help restore depleted ecosystems. And he also adds, so I tell you, save the world and eat an oyster, redemption on the half shell with lemon and Tabasco. So I'm all along with Barton there. So thank you for this opportunity to talk about oyster aquaculture today. I'm happy to answer any questions if there's time, and if not, feel free to reach me at the email address provided. Thanks so much.
All right, great. Thank you very much, Lisa. That was a very interesting talk on oyster aquaculture, and I learned a little bit about the benefits of eating oysters that I didn't know, and I'm sure others did too. Again, we're just going to move to our final speaker, since we only have a couple minutes left on this webinar, so you can send Lisa an email if you have any questions about her presentation. And we are going to shift gears to hear from Sarah for a very brief presentation on oyster shell recycling.
Thanks, Emily. Okay, I'm gonna share my screen right here. So yes, I will be very brief due to our timing here. Can you see my screen okay?
Yep.
Emily? Yep, okay.
Just push the presentation view. We can see both slides.
You can see both screens.
Mm.
One sec.
Sarah, if you go to the top where it says display settings, you should be able to switch it. Yeah, that. Swap presenter view and slide view.
Good?
Yep,
Good.
there you go.
Great.
Okay. Okay, so real quick, I'm just going to talk about PDE's shell recycling program. They talked a lot about, you know, how we eat and harvest oysters, and Dave mentioned that some oysters' favorite thing to grow new oysters on is other oyster shell. So when we take those oysters out to eat them, it's kind of a good idea to get them back in the water however we can to provide habitat for more oysters. So Dave also talked about this a little bit, so I'm not going to go into this. Lots of benefits to oysters by putting them back in the water, provide habitat for lots of other sea life, provide water quality uplift through their filtration, buffer water pH, and shoreline stabilization. Lots of benefits. So this is our general recycling process. It generally starts with eating of the oysters. We collect the oysters. They have to be cured. They then have to generally be put in bags, and then we use them in our restoration and other reuse scenarios. First, it starts with eating them. And again, I hope all of you are oyster eaters on here today. But we collect our shell from 8 different restaurants in Newcastle County and 1 in Kent County. This is a map. There's 2 in Hockessin, George & Sons, and the Back Burner. Most of them are in Wilmington, and 1 in Newark, the Blue Crab Grill, and then the Pearl Oyster at Dover Downs in Dover. We also have a public drop-off site at George & Sons in Hockessin, where people who buy oysters, live oysters, and cook them at home, you have a place to bring your shell. Big caveat, we've stopped all of our collections currently for COVID. We hope to start again soon, maybe in the fall, but right now we're not collecting anywhere. So just FYI, but it will all be up and running again in the future, so watch our website. I put in the link, in the chat, a direct link to our website about our oyster recycling. It also lists where to buy, potential places to buy Delaware Bay oysters, all the info about our shell recycling that I might not be able to cover in this brief presentation here. We go around and we collect all the shells in our big bins on our big truck. We've collected over 5,600 bushels of shells since we started collecting. That's about 150 bushels a month. A bushel weighs about 50 pounds, so about 3 tons a month. This was our 2019 numbers. Slightly more in the summer, but it kind of fluctuates throughout the year. We then bring them back to our shell lot in Wilmington, where they have to sit for 3 to 6 months, depending on the weather, to cure. And that's when all the yucky stuff that was on them gets off. All the insects come, bacteria, decomposing all that gross stuff on there. So you get a nice clean shell that you can put back in the water. So here are some of our shell piles. You see they're nice and white, no more gunk on them. Then we have to bag them. And that's really a process. We need tons of volunteers for this process. It's a pretty big task, and we usually get mostly volunteers to help with it. And just putting them in the bags, we can use them in our projects and more easily, and they're just kind of easier to move around that way. So here's us on some shell bags that we got there. We've had lots of volunteers help with this, lots of volunteer hours. We've bagged over 5,200 bags, which can help restore over 1,700 feet of shoreline. Also lots of help from PDE staff. If you have groups, I'll talk about this in a minute, that would like to come help bag, we always need more volunteers. Currently we have about 2,500 bags and 2,000 bushels of loose shell in stock, ready to go for projects. Finally, we want to reuse these. We mostly, New Jersey and the growing industry kind of has their own way to get shell, but we mostly use shell and provide shell to other sorts of restoration projects, primarily for ecological benefits, water quality benefits, erosion benefits, kind of separate from more of the oyster growing to eat process. So we use them a lot in living shorelines, where we're putting them in front of the shore to make a more softer transition from land to water, like you would find naturally. You want the marsh to expand and move out to more grass, where it gradually goes into intertidal areas, where you're going to have some of those intertidal oyster reefs, and then continuing off into the bay. We've used over 5,000 bags in our projects, and lots of loose shell as well. This is a picture of our Miss Pillion living shoreline in Milford, Delaware. Each of these cusps is made of different products, including oyster shell, used for stabilization and as habitat for new rib mussels and oysters, both which can provide water quality benefits. These are those shoreline cusps. We use core logs sometimes, using it less and less, and then our oyster shell bags. And then these are our kind of more offshore intertidal breakwaters used to reflect energy from the water. We use shell bags there, as well as these oyster castles. The oyster castles also recruit, so this is just a cool picture to show the oysters recruiting. And these are the oysters and other rib mussels, oysters recruiting onto our shell bags. So what can you do? You can eat at our shell recycling partners, all those ones that I mentioned earlier, and also recycle your own shell when we start that back up again, hopefully very soon. If you know people who eat oysters, tell them about these programs and that they can make more, responsible decisions when they're eating oysters, recycling their shell, or eating at certain locations. Volunteer, particularly if you have large groups of groups that need volunteer work. Shell bagging can be awesome for that, so please get in touch with me. Support nature-based restoration for everything, shoreline stabilization, all the good stuff can help support us. And number one, follow us on social media and interact with our posts so you can see what we're doing, your friends can see what we're doing, and we get the word out about our restoration processes and shell recycling. All right, there's my information. I know that was really fast, we're running out of time, but that's pretty much it for me. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Sarah. And also thanks to Dave and Lisa for presenting on today's webinar. I know we are a little bit over, but I'm just gonna quickly wrap up to let folks know about our last webinar in our 3-part series of What Lies Beneath: Signature Species of the Delaware Estuary. The last webinar will be on Tuesday, August 25th from 12 to 1 p.m. And the link, which is right there and Emily can put into the chat, you can register for that webinar. So again, thanks for everyone for participating today in today's webinar. We hope you found it informative and interesting, and we hope to see you in our next webinar. Please consider making a donation to support PDE achieve our mission. Any amount helps. We'll be sending a follow-up email with the webinar recording and some important links and resources. So thanks again. We hope to see you in the future.